Hey guys, what's up? This is What's the Tech, and some of you guys may already know this or at least heard about it. The controversial move that Apple's going to be rolling out a brand new set of features in iOS 15 that is primarily aimed at combating the distribution of child pornography and child sexual assault material, or CSAM. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this now is because I wanted to give some space for something this big of a topic, because there was going to be some wrong information out there and I wanted to make sure we get this absolutely right. Also, it gives time for Apple and relevant stakeholders to give public opinion and public commentary on the matter. Now off the bat, Apple acknowledges that they bungled this rollout by announcing too many large sweeping systems at the same time. It confused people. Apple still insists to this day that those who are against this new CSAM scanning mechanism, that they are just confused, and that's why they have such a harsh reaction to it. On top of that, Apple has released a brand new FAQ in the matter, engaged with the tech press, as well as made some adjustments to the CSAM system in general. Moreover, it should be noted right in the beginning that there are very real organizations that actually laud Apple for this effort, primarily child safety organizations, as well as a minority of security and privacy advocates. Now on the flip side of that, there's been even more backlash from a majority of privacy security experts and advocates, some internal Apple employees, and anecdotally speaking, about anyone I could present this issue to in as aggressively neutral a stance as possible. Almost no one I've talked to or seen online is supportive of this measure, but we all agree that Apple is trying to do a good thing here. It should be said early in the video, of course, that we all are against CSAM imagery. So what exactly is Apple doing here? And we're talking about specifically about CSAM scanning into iCloud photos. Well, the gist of it is that they've engineered a amazingly complex system that is inobtrusively obtrusive as possible in scanning every photo you upload to Apple's iCloud servers on a device that runs iOS 15. First up, this only applies if and only if your iOS 15 device has a setting turned on where you upload your photos taken on your device to iCloud. As the photos first begin their process of being uploaded to iCloud, they first undergo a cryptographic process called NeuralHashing, whereas a digital image is converted to a set of numbers, the numbers representing the values in the image, what's going on in the picture. These numbers here are called a NeuralHash, and this could apply to any digital image because any digital image is just a file that could be translated into ones and zeros. Now these sets of numbers, which is a NeuralHash representing an actual photo that no one sees by the way, is then compared to another NeuralHash number of CSAM imagery provided by the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. And this database is stored on your iDevice on iOS 15 moving forward. All of this occurs on device without Apple, any law enforcement agency, or the NCMEC even being aware or having privy on watching the process occur. Now in plain speak, what's happening here is that your iPhone is comparing numbers against each other, numbers representing images that you took or downloaded, against numbers that Apple via NCMEC has on file and comparing to each other. If those two hashes match up, then we have a match. Now there are primarily two reasons that Apple is using neural hashing as the methodology here. The first one is that, and perhaps most importantly, this avoids very simple evasive measures that child predators could use, such as simply cropping an image, deleting one pixel, or adding a color filter on top of the image. It changes the file, but the values within that image, the actual things in it, still correspond to each other, so that would match in a neural hash comparison. Also, this stands to probably be the only way to compare images without necessarily comparing images. You're comparing representations of images. Now secondly, if there is a match, what happens next is that your iPhone creates a safety voucher that pairs the uploaded images NeuralHash with the CSAM images NeuralHash, as well as the ability to decrypt it by a real person, an Apple employee, if a certain threshold is met. This is presumably an Apple employee, and this individual will have to be trained for an unenviable role. Now we did recently find out that the threshold that Apple is using is 30, as unveiled by Craig Federighi in an interview with the Wall Street Journal conducted by Joanna Stern. Upon reaching that threshold, it needs to be stressed that this is not reviewed by AI, but a real human person. If after that human review it is determined that all 30 hits were positive, what happens next is that account is then disabled. That information is then passed on to the NCMEC, and then presumably relevant authorities will follow up on the matter. Now Apple says you can appeal the process if you feel like you were mistakenly flagged, but good luck with that with the FBI knocking on your door. Apple hasn't said how the appeals process would work, but I'm sure they have other things to worry about, such as informing and engaging the general public. Now Apple attests that this very narrow implementation is designed to have, roughly speaking, only 1 in a trillion chance of getting a false positive. That's what they claim. Now do with that as you may. So now that you know how CSAM scanning to iCloud works, why are people upset? What's the controversy about? And you may have recognized this as I explain it to you. This is in stark contrast to Apple's commitment to privacy. Apple is often regarded by enthusiasts, the layman, and also myself, into being one of the last tech companies that really cares about your privacy. In fact, it's actually a point of pride amongst the more Apple faithful, those who are more in the fanboy category, because that's how they warrant the higher cost of an iPhone actually. Because the product is not mining your data is not subsidizing the cost of that phone or tablet or smart speaker. And can you necessarily blame them? Apple as a company has touted privacy as one of its main selling points and has also gone the offensive against others for having a weaker stance on privacy. Any reduction in privacy, no matter how small, is going to be seen as a blowback to the brand. To some, this is a small reduction. To others, this is a large. But what we can all agree on is it's a reduction of some sort. Now, the second thing that's controversial about this is the chances of false positives. Now, the chances of false positives here are resoundingly low if you use Apple's numbers. But the issue of someone's life being absolutely destroyed is, I would go even lower, because there is still a human that's doing a manual review process. Now, in between that step, between a manual review by a human as well as those false positives, as low as they are, someone's trust is broken, someone's privacy is violated there. Because in order to determine something to be a false positive, that human Apple employee, presumably Apple employee, would have to look at images that are, we can assume, lewd in nature if it matches close enough to CSAM imagery. And if it's not just one false match, from that case, we can determine that someone's intimate pictures were then just violated by that employee. Now, of course, that means it happened out of like a big number. It's not just 30 trillion. It's much bigger how odds work. But those images, which are probably going to be lewd in nature, was seen by someone else, someone that was not supposed to see it. And now thirdly, and perhaps the most important, if you care about my stance on the matter, is that the implementation and existence of this software or this capability means it could be abused. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, that's because that's the same defense and line of reasoning that Apple used in standing up publicly against the FBI and a judge's court order against Apple to unlocking the iPhone of the San Bernardino shooter, the domestic terrorist who committed an act of mass shooting in my home state of California. We had to remember that at the time, this was a very tough decision for Apple to make. Polling was pretty evenly split on this. In fact, at times, it probably looked like it was skewing against Apple. But it was one of those times where it's the right decision and it's the hard decision. If this rolls out, because the capability and how CSAM Detection iCloud works, authoritarian governments could then turn around and ask Apple to also scan for the NeuralHashes of, let's say, Tankman, pro-gay rights imagery, pro-women imagery, or even just opposition political leaders. Because these are digital images, it could be deduced down to NeuralHashes and scan against what's on an iPhone. And because it exists, it could be done and abused. And in the United States, just because it requires an iCloud upload to trigger doesn't mean in those other countries it needs to have iCloud. It could trigger without iCloud if those governments really wanted it to. This is the expansion of intrusive mass surveillance on a grand scale that not even the Stasi could have ever dreamed of. And the scary thing about this is that it doesn't have to necessarily need an iCloud backup to trigger it. Because it exists, it could also be tweaked and fine-tuned a little bit to occur on device in general, just with every image or photo you download or take. Now, Apple has on record said that they will resolutely refuse any government's attempt in expanding the CSAM scanning mechanism into having anything else besides CSAM imagery detection. So think of your political dissidents. They've said on record that they're going to say no to that. But historically, Apple has bent to the will of China and Russia, both because of real legislative and regulatory pressures, as well as an opaque judicial process that doesn't really have much safeguards in fighting against authoritarian tendencies. To this day, upon setting up your iPhone in Russia, or any device for that matter, you're prompted with an extra menu that no one else in the world has that shows a pre-approved list of state-sanctioned applications. Now, it could be to boost adoption of domestic applications, or it could also be a way for the Russian government on having easier access to data of its citizenry. Now in China, the list goes far, far further. They are experts in this field. But most recently, Apple's data center in China is managed and staffed by Chinese state employees. They have access to it. Given enough time, they could break the encryption. Now, assuming Apple upholds its principles, They could either threaten to leave a market to make a government back down and then ultimately leave a market, or they could quietly agree and acquiesce and then implement it quietly without the world noticing that they would be scanning things beyond CSAM images. And if we're using historical precedent here, I would wager a bet that Apple would choose the latter as opposed to the former, because you haven't seen them abandon any markets yet. I am personally disappointed that this topic, this conversation, isn't held with much larger tech YouTubers, because this is just as equally important as right to repair, and I would argue maybe even more, but if anything, it's just as important as right to repair, and everyone talked about that. Your right to privacy is a human right. It is a fundamental right that should not be eroded or traded away. Now, the only real way we could change this from happening is to valve your wallets and also just have this frank discussion and share it with other people. Not this video if you don't want to, I get that. But just talk about this topic in general, about how creepy and how ripe for abuse this is. Admittedly, this is probably the most private way of scanning for CSAM imagery, of which Apple is pretty bad actually compared to the rest of the industry in reporting. But with all the privacy trade-offs and its massive ability of being abused, I don't think it's worth it. I don't think that trade-off is worth it. Apple's goal here is noble. We are all against the fight for CSAM and distribution of it. But what happens on our devices should stay on our devices, and there shouldn't be any mechanism or software that even exists that has the ability to peer into our photos. Now let's end it with Mr. Cook himself, CEO of Apple, Mr. Tim Apple, who has been notably absent in this discussion, by the way. This is What the Tech. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Peace.
Technology can do so many things, but there are many things technology should never be allowed to do. And the way you not allow it is to not create it. David, some things are hard, and some things are right, and some things are both. This is one of those things.
And in this case, you believe there are some things that just should never be created.
Correct. I think safety of the public is incredibly important. Safety of our kids, safety of our families is very important. The protection of people's data is incredibly important. And so the trade-off here is we know that doing this could expose people to incredible vulnerabilities. This is not something that we would create. This would be bad for America. It would also set a precedent that I believe many people in America would be offended by. And so when you think about those which are knowns compared to something that might be there, I believe we are making the right choice.